G'day year 11/12. I've got to get out of that habit. We're going to look at lesson 5 today, which is the social theories of change. It's going to be a big one, so I'm going to split each theory into its own video. Conflict theory is going to be the most detailed and the one that I spend the most time on. One being because that's the theory that we are going to look at when we study Saudi Arabia. But it's really important that we know the key features of each of the following theories because, and the reason being is that you can get asked a question, a multiple choice question on any of these theories in your HSC. You may also get asked to apply a certain theory to a short answer question. So it's really important that we have a good understanding of what each theory is, enough that we'll be able to differentiate between them should we get asked a question about it in our HSC. There's only one that we need to know in super depth because we get to pick one for our country study, and that's conflict theory. So that's the main one I'm going to focus here on in this video, and I'll do evolutionary functionalist and interactionalist in another one. But that's why you'll find that I'm being a bit more detailed with conflict theory than I am the other three, and we'll then apply that theory to Saudi Arabia much later on in lesson 12. So for now, we're on lesson 17. There's two key dot points we're going to look at here today. So we're going to look at key features of each of these theories, and then we're also going to break down the theories as an attempts for them to explain change to society, resistance to change, and looking at structural changes and the processes of and agents of that social change and the direction that that change goes in. So there's a lot to unpack here, but that's why I'll put it into different videos. So here is conflict theory, page 17. Make sure you sign and date that, and off we go. So conflict. So we're gonna, before we get into conflict theory, so we're gonna look at what a social theory is in general, just to help us understand the framing and context of it. So we've got two key dot points here with a lot of sub dot points to go underneath it. So I think it's probably a good idea to cross off each theory as you do it so that you know where you're up to, up here as well. And then here, each theory that we look at, we're going to break into three sort of sections. So we're going to look at the structural change of the theory. We're going to look at the process and agents of that social change in relation to the theory, and then the directions of change. So I will come back to this in a second, but it's helpful if I explain what the theory is first. So any social theory that we look at is developed to help provide an explanation of changes in society. They're a way of looking at it as a means to explain it, but they are by no means a factual piece of information. That's a really important bit to highlight here. They're not factual. They are just theories of explanation. So the whole idea of a theory, any theory that is, and social theories are no different, is that researchers have come up with them as an attempt to explain something. Whereas in this case, social theories are trying to explain why certain changes happen to societies, usually at a macro level. Okay, so that's the main focus of a social theory here. So because they're not 100% concrete and foolproof like any theory, they are subject to criticism. Okay, so theories are subject to criticism, so definitely highlight that. They're also subject to acceptance depending on the brevity of their argument and how much they can prove that's true. And critical analysis of each theory is really important, so I'd underline and highlight that as well. So mostly in the HSC, when you get asked a theory question, they're going to ask you to either justify one, evaluate it, or assess it. And so you can say that a theory is really great in explaining change in this way, but it might not be good at changing or explaining change in that way. And that's okay to say. That shows to the HSC marker that you have a high level of critical thinking skill there, because you're saying, yes, it applies here, but it doesn't apply here. So some theories may only be unique to a particular place or a point in time, or only exist with the recognition of some factors. So some theories are really niche, others are more broad. Like any theory, they're based on ideas and observations from real life examples, and they allow people to view society from different perspectives. And the last thing to note is that all theories have levels of acceptance and rejection. It's like any belief system, any religion, any value that anyone holds, there's always levels of acceptance and rejection to it, and social theories are no different. So by no means are these perfect things that explain how a country has changed, but they certainly give a frame or a lens to view it in, and that can be helpful. So social theories explain a lot of things in life. So things like demographic shifts, this idea of as you get older, you're going to have an aging population, and that might breed certain problems with younger workforce and overburdens on the tax system and things like that. So there's demographic shifts. Some theories explain conflict and war and why revolutions happen. So why the Russian Revolution happened, for example, and why the French Revolution happened. We're going to look at a few examples of that in conflict theory and how that relates to Saudi Arabia. Cultural imperialism is a social theory. So the idea that bred that was that colonialism, or that British culture and Western culture was superior to any indigenous culture around the world. So there's social theories to explain that. There's social theories to explain secularization, which is the idea of moving to more non-religious institutions. There are still some countries that do have religious institutions as law, and Saudi Arabia is one of them, which we're going to look at later on. And this idea of social dislocation as well, that more and more people are going to be moving to city hubs because that's where business is, and we value that more than we value, I guess, rural areas. So there's lots of different social theories out there to explain change. Some of them are correct in some ways, some of them can be criticized and not correct in others. One last thing before we jump into conflict theory is that any time we talk about any social theory, because our syllabus dot point here is asking for directions of change, so we're looking at what type of change each social theory has. And there are 3 types here. So for example, there's linear social change. We looked at this word in one of our previous lessons, and that's where something changes from point A to point B. Okay, it's sequential. It goes from one stage to another, A, B, C, D, E, 1, 2, 3, 4, and it's clear. It moves in steps. So an example of linear social change is evolutionary theory, this idea that we went from one stage to another in a really clear change over time, and we went from point A to point B. It's very clear. The other type of change that we look at is cyclical change. So these are where social change happens in a cycle or in patterns, and something that occurs regularly, and it regularly repeats itself, and it often occurs in the same way. So this idea, we see it in, if you look at it at a meso level in a lot of countries, you see it with fashion, how fashions styles come in and out. Tight jeans are in, and then it's ripped denim jeans, and it's really loose baggy jeans, and then it's tight jeans again, and it comes in this kind of full circle, where we see this regression between retro outfits and more modern and contemporary ones. So that's an example of cyclical change. And then there's our last change, which is called dialectical change. And the image we've used to represent this is a spiral. Okay, so dialectical change is complicated. It's almost like a mixture of linear and cyclical. It might go in steps in some ways, and then it will cycle back, but then it will change the direction altogether. And so that's kind of why it spins around like that, because it combines elements of both linear and cyclical change. Its desires and viewpoints often contradict one another, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more down here. Whereas social change occurs through opposing forces here. So the idea is that, to stop environmental pollution, we need to have more renewable energies. Okay, so we change that, and then it's like, well, the problem's not actually renewable energy, it's our way of living that's the problem, so we need to fix that first. And then so you can see how it goes in a completely different direction, and then people go, well, no, it's not the way we're living that's the problem, It's how we're viewing the way we're living that's the problem. And so you can see how it kind of goes in this dialectical circle and arguments with which often kind of contradict each other. So they're the three different directions of change. When we're looking at each social theory, there's going to be a little bit or a little subheadings where we look at the direction of change, because it's important to note that in any HSC response or answer. So that's the basis of what a social theory is. Going to look into conflict theory more in depth now. Here we go. So Karl Marx developed this theory, which is this bloke here. He was a fan of socialism, which is a different form of government, which is more people focused as opposed to big business and macro level focus. They're very much focused on the little guy, right? The belief of conflict theory is that social inequality leads to conflict. So that's really important to note, that it's social inequality that leads to conflict. So conflict theory's whole thing is that any change that happens in society is due to conflict, due to people, I guess, being disenfranchised or angry with their social position. And then that leads to conflict, which then leads to the change that they're after. So the idea is that oppressed people will stand up to oppressors to force change, and that'll reach a social boiling point. So the idea is that, let's say everyone in a factory is sick of getting paid $2 an hour while the guy at the top's getting paid $20 an hour. They all group together and take action, whether that's through a lawsuit, whether that's physical action, whatever it is, it leads to conflict. So these guys are considered the lower class, and then the guy at the top's considered the upper class, and they have a clash where it reaches boiling point, and then some kind of change occurs after that, which alters and changes the structure of how that factory might work, for example. So for example, the guys working might get a pay rise, and the guy at the top might get a pay decrease, and then everyone's happy again, and then the idea is that they'll have conflict again and it will change again. So when we look at types of change here, it's usually think a revolution. So it's usually fast, radical change, and it is transformative change. So definitely highlight that. Conflict theory, change that happens is transformative. It's quick and rapid change, and it has lasting effects on society. Okay, and it's structural change as well is a really good point that you might want to add there as well. So transformative structural change, it changes how institutions run, whether that's governments at a macro level, institutions at a meso level, or how the family operates at a micro level. So examples of this throughout history is the Russian Revolution, where Russia used to be a monarch, so they used to have a king and queen similar to England, and then that government got overthrown, and then it became a communist government for some time, and now it's no longer communist. So that's gone through a few conflict theory related changes. The 1960s civil rights movement, which you guys learnt in history last year in America and Australia, is an example of conflict theory. So different social classes showing conflict, which then leads to some kind of structural and social change. So for example, black people having equal rights to white people in the written letter of the law anyway. The marriage equality movement in Australia, an example of conflict theory. You had the LGBTQIA plus community competing with social institutions that didn't recognise their sexuality as morally correct, and over time through conflict over a number of years, there was transformative change because the structure of society changed, the law changed, and then it also changed the micro level structure of families later on in the track as well. So there's some examples there of conflict theory and how it sort of comes to be. We're going to look more at those specific processes down here. The criticism of conflict theory is that it doesn't account for micro or meso changes as much. Its focus is purely at a macro level, and then you can see how that macro level change will fizzle down to the bottom, but its main focus is change at a macro level. We're thinking governments, institutions, revolutions, that kind of thing. So conflict theory, according to Karl Marx, was that every country at some stage will turn into a socialist country, and then they'll turn into a communist country. But most Western nations have avoided a communist revolution. So the theory isn't necessarily applicable in a lot of cases, right? It has in some, but the majority of countries around the world have yet to have that. The idea or the argument of conflict theory is that it's yet to happen and it will at some stage. So I guess you could say that's a weak criticism because it's arguing based on something that hasn't been proven yet. Another criticism is that the sole basis of the theory is that people are going to be in conflict all the time, and that's not necessarily true. So some humans might be seeking more power and looking to have conflict, but not all those in power are corrupt. So that's what conflict theory is assuming, is that the upper class is evil and the lower class are the hard done by people, whereas we know that there are a lot of people with a lot of power and authority in the world, and that are rich, but they're not scumbags of human beings. Another criticism is that it doesn't acknowledge social change is possible without violent action or any revolution. So the idea that there is no macro level social change that happens without conflict, where we know that that's simply not true, because a lot of macro level change can happen due to mutual agreement and consent. Positive aspects of social change, such as aid or charity, they use them as processes designed to control the masses. So the idea of even if there is a positive change, that it'll lead to conflict later on in the piece anyway. This is an interesting image that sort of fits conflict theory. You've got this social hierarchy here, and it's called the capitalist pyramid. So Karl Marx, being a socialist, was very much against the capitalist system. And the idea of this society here is that you have fewer people up the top enjoying most of the riches and power and authority in the world, and then it gradually goes down to where you see at the bottom what's called the working class, and you can see that they're carrying the weight of society on their shoulders. So you can see on the side here this idea that we work for you, we feed you, and you shoot at us, you fool us, and you rule us. So we're making the rich even richer and ourselves only poorer. So you can see this kind of tension here is all about the lower class here doing all the hard work and getting none of the reward, while the top and upper class feeds off all the power, and then this will eventually lead to conflict where a change will happen, which will change the structure of this sort of society. And this is how it happens. So these 2 pages here are probably, I'm not saying these 2 pages aren't important here, but these are probably the most important in relation to conflict theory. So these are the 3 sub-dot points here that we look at for each theory. So I've given you the key features of conflict theory in these 2 pages, so what it's about and where its criticisms are. And then here we're going to go into a lot of the detail about the theory itself. Okay, so structural changes within society, which is this first little sub-dot point. So what this is going to look at, if you want to write a little side note here, is how conflict theory changes society. Okay, so we're looking at how it creates structural change. This here is almost how it plays out in order. So what I'd like you guys to do on this left-hand side here is draw an arrow that just goes all the way down here. Kind of like, I'll show you. Kind of like that arrow there. Yeah? So draw that all the way down here, because this is the theory on how conflict theory creates social change and structural change. So the first thing, you might even want to number them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. So the first thing to understand is that classes, so I'd highlight this, classes exist in society. There's the wealthy ruling class and the working class. Now above wealthy ruling class, can you write upper class? Because that's what we'll refer to it colloquially. And above the working class, can you write the lower class? If you want to use the technical terms as well, we've got the bourgeoisie or bourgeois and the proletariat. So these are the technical terms that they've been coined by Karl Marx here. So to understand the theory, you need to understand that two classes exist within society. There's no other classes, just two. There's the wealthy class, the upper class, the powerful people, and then there's the working class, who are seen as having less power and less authority and less human rights even. The second point of the theory is that any social change comes about because of inequalities within society between these two classes. Above inequalities, can you also write plus conflict? So any social change that happens in society, according to the theory, is because of the inequalities and conflicts between the ruling class, the upper class, the wealthy class, and the working class, the proletariat. The idea is that the ruling class, so the guys at the top, they control most of the resources and they use it greedily to gain power, or unfairly, which I think if you can to see just above that, draw a little arrow and write unfairly gain power. So the ruling class is trying to control all the resources. Above here you can write power and authority, because they've got the most power and authority. So the idea is that they only use their power to benefit themselves, and they have no intention of sharing or spreading that wealth equally amongst the lower class. So these are sort of the different laws and rules that sort of have to happen for conflict theory to make sense in a society. So because of all this, a social hierarchy emerges that creates a distinction in class based on, highlight this, wealth, power, and prestige. So the idea that because there's a perceived upper class and a perceived lower class, this social hierarchy gets created, and the idea is that this hierarchy is unequal. Okay, it's unequal because all these people perceived in conflict theory are doing most of the work while these guys are reaping all the benefits, and they're hogging that power and authority, and then they make changes which only benefit themselves and make the conditions worse for the people below them. So these are sort of the big ticket items, or the background contextual information, if you like, that needs to exist for conflict to start to happen. So we get this picture of two social classes. There's these rich, powerful guys up top who are quite literally shitting on everyone below them. They're using all their power and resources for their own gain. They have no intention of spreading the wealth and helping out their fellow man, if you will. And that these inequalities over time start to create conflict. Okay, hence the word conflict theory. The next point here is that these inequalities cause conflict between the dominant group, so the bourgeois, who maintain their values and norms through their economic and social power, so they maintain their power, and that those in society that have no real access to power or resources. So this is where, I guess, in brackets here, or a little side note, if you want to summarize this, conflict starts to happen. Okay, conflict starts to happen because of these unfair social hierarchy, and then it gets worse from here. So you can see how it's sort of slowly progressing down. That's why I got you to draw that arrow. This next point here is that the struggle for power and control reaches a breaking point, highlight this whole bit, in which revolution will occur and the working class will overthrow the ruling class. So this is the idea of conflict theory. You've got these two classes, they're fighting with each other because it's the wealth distribution is so unfair. It starts to create a lot of tension, and then through that tension it reaches a breaking point, or a boiling point they call it, in which revolution will occur, and the guys on the bottom here who are carrying society decide to drop it and flip it on its head and revolt and have conflict. So what ends up happening after that is that the social change occurs when those without power, the proletariat, challenge the existing social organization, or the bourgeois, to compete for these resources. See, it's all about competing for resources and wealth, power, as we said here, wealth, power, and prestige. So this is what everyone's fighting over, and they want it to be more equal. So this is when the change occurs. There's a boiling point, and then something, I guess, snaps, and then as these conflicts play out, social change results, and it's either abrupt and revolutionary change that occurs as a result of the conflict. So that's the final piece of the puzzle. So to surmise, you've got two ruling classes in society, the wealthy class and the working class. The guys at the top who hog all the power, wealth and prestige and resources, and they use it only for their own benefit. And then the guys at the bottom are sitting there doing all the hard work and getting little of the reward. They're treated poorly, they've got low social status, they don't have much money, they don't have much power, wealth or prestige within their society, and that makes them angry. So what happens is that over time there's conflict that occurs between those two because of the wealth gap and the wealth disparity, and eventually that leads to a breaking point where the lower class can't take it anymore and they snap, and then something happens then to create change, and it's a really big structural change. So for example, when we look at the Russian Revolution, this was when the kings and queens, or the monarchy, was perceived to be holding and hogging all the power. You then had the disgruntled union factions here that started to split off, and they took it over by force, okay, through physical conflict. If we look at it in another lens, say the 1960s civil rights movement, you've got the wealthy ruling class, which is considered the white person in America, and you've got the working lower class, or the proletariat, which was considered the black African American. And so what happened was these guys were competing for resources. We would see that the working class or black African American people down the bottom weren't getting a good deal. Over time, you can see that there's conflict brewing, and that was in the civil rights movements with Martin Luther King Jr., all the sit-ins that they did in America. You saw the conflict occurring between the two people. You had, say, the Black Panthers, and the Ku Klux Klan fighting for all these different rights, until one day, it reaches a breaking point, and then revolution occurs, and that's when the laws changed in America to allow black people to have more equal rights in terms of voting, property. They got rid of segregation and all the Jim Crow's laws. They got rid of black schools and white schools, and that black people have to sit here and white people have to sit there on the buses. They got rid of all that, and that was due to conflict theory, or that's the theory that explains that change, is that those two classes, the tension occurred so much that the big social transformative change happened. And that as a result, there's a new social order about things. So that's kind of how the theory plays itself out, yeah? This next bit, looking at processes and agents of social change, these are the things that the processes and agents of social change are like the key players, okay? And these key players are the working class and the ruling class. So in terms of the processes of change, conflict theory proposes that social stability is what they call a temporary state of affairs. Karl Marx coining the term that the engine of progress is conflict. So according to conflict theory, any major social transformative change that happens has to happen through conflict, and that social stability, I guess, is an illusion until the very next revolution occurs, which is idealized in this quote, that revolution is inevitable. So this was the kind of, I've put this image in here as a that kind of explains it. And I'll explain it a bit more here in directions of change. So the idea is that you have internal economic contradictions, or some kind of contradiction. So for example, that say the contradiction is that in America, all men are equal, right? Fight for independence, all that kind of stuff. Whereas in actuality, you had the white guy sitting up top and the black guy sitting down the bottom. So it was a contradiction, okay? So what ends up happening is that you push for social change, which then results in a new economic or a new system, i.e. black and white people are now equal in the eyes of the law. But then the idea is that that new system leads to conflict again, and then the cycle starts again. So the idea here being that, and we saw that with the Black Lives Matter movement, the idea that, okay, we're legally equal now, however, white people are still doing things that black people get in more trouble for. We saw that with all the Black Lives Matter protests, the idea of police brutality. Yes, we're equal in the eyes of the law, but are we actually equal in a cultural sense in our beliefs and values? So there's another conflict sort of starts again. And this leads us into the last point, which is the directions of change. So conflict theory is dialectical. Now you might be thinking, no, it's cyclical, Mr. Brown, because you keep saying the conflict repeats itself. So we know that dialectical change combines elements of cyclical and linear change, but it's a little bit different. The idea between dialectical change is that you have what's called a thesis, an antithesis, and a synthesis. So the thesis, think of it, and if you want to write this above here, is your original idea. Okay, so write that above thesis, is the original idea. So the original idea, for example, if we're going to stick with this civil rights movement, is that the white man's burden. White men are supposedly better than black men or any other type of skin color, racial, ethnicity, whatever. That was the original idea and argument, right? There was then an antithesis, or something that happens, and this is the counter argument. So this is the original argument or idea, this is the counter argument or idea that says, well, hang on a minute, you're not better than me, I'm better than you, or we're actually equal and we should have equal rights, and that's the idea here. And then what ends up happening is that through the conflict between the original idea and the counter argument, you get what's called the synthesis, which is when these two ideas come together and forms a new way of thinking. So this is the original argument, this is the counter argument, and then this becomes the new argument, or the new and improved argument, or the best of both worlds, if you will. It's when these two come together to sort of make peace. But then what happens again is that people come up with the counter argument for that new system, and then they have a synthesis. And so you can see that it contradicts and it goes around in circles. So that's the cyclical nature of it. But the linear change element is that it goes from antithesis to synthesis, antithesis to synthesis. So it's A to B to A to B. Well, it's technically A, B, C, A, C, A, C, So that's why it's dialectical, because it's random, it's sporadic, and it kind of goes around in circles a little bit. So I'll explain it in another way. So to get this idea in your head, the idea or the authority of parents goes unchallenged in the early stages of a child's life. So this complete obedience is our synthesis, the idea that the parent knows best and you do what they say because they know what's best for you. Okay, that's the original argument here. I'm just trying to put it in a different way to make you understand it. The antithesis, however, is that as the child develops through adolescence, the phase that you guys are in, or just ending in now, we typically see a phase of rebellion because the child's developing into an adult. They want to assert their own character, their own ideas, and they do this through rebelling against the authority of the parents. This rebellion, for example, is your antithesis. So what you have now is you have the original idea that the parents know best and they know what's good for you, and that's the best thing for a young person. The antithesis then is the young person saying, no, you don't know what's best for me, I know what's best for me, you're right, you're wrong, and I'm right. So that's the new idea. But as the teenager matures into an adult, and they've been an adult for a while, their attitude towards authority in general changes, and particularly towards their parents, it moderates. So by achieving independence, they don't need to be a rebel any longer. They don't need to fight against the rules. They realize that there are some elements that of their parents and the authority they had was correct, but they also understood the value of their own opinion and things like that. And that independence is your synthesis. Okay? And then you could argue the antithesis then again is that as you become a parent, you know what's best for your kid, and then you can sort of see how it starts again. So the idea that you have your original argument, that then changes with the counter argument, and then you sort of meet halfway in the middle, and then that changes again, and then you rectify it again, and it changes again, and you rectify it again, and then you might even come back to the original thesis at some point. So in summary, I've put it like this: you have your original argument, your counter argument, and your refined and balanced argument. So that's the direction of change with conflict theory, and that's all the bits of the syllabus that we've got to go through with that. So if I can summarize as quickly as I can, conflict theory says that structural change only happens due to conflict in society. The idea is that this conflict happens because of unequal wealth distribution, unequal power distribution within society between two classes, the upper class and the lower class, the top dogs and the guys that do all the work. This then creates change because of conflict, and you can sort of imagine that that table gets flipped upside down, or it changes, and that there's a new social order, and that's represented in these directions of change, this idea of the original argument, the counter argument, and then the new refined argument or way of living. So that's conflict theory. You can, I guess, take a deep breath. If you have a little bit of headache after this one, that's okay. We are going to apply this to Saudi Arabia, and we're going to do a lot of practice and talk about it a bit more. But that's conflict theory there for you. The rest will not be nearly as long as this, or as, I guess, complex as this. We went into a lot of detail because this is the one that we are going to be looking at in Saudi Arabia. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.